Welcome to another Bear Attack Stories Marathon showcasing some of the most brutal bear attacks covered on the channel so far. These stories include a man who believed he was friends with a massive male grizzly until it fatally mauled him, a mother who was mauled to death in front of her kids, and much more. Hit that like button and subscribe right now. These are the most terrifying bear attack stories you will ever hear. Welcome to Final Affliction. November 4th, 1988. Three friends decide to go hunting on Baranof Island. This island is one of a few in the Alaskan Alexander Archipelago that borders Canada. It is a wildlife haven. Humpback whales, dolphins, otters, and porpoises frequent the icy waters. Its northern tip is used by a breeding colony of stellar sea lions. The island is also home to mountain goats, Sitka black-tailed deer, and grizzly bears. Harley Sievenpiper, David Trago, and James Hendricks arrived at the southeastern corner of Baranof Island at Port Alexander for their hunting adventure. They carried with them camping gear, rifles, and ammunition. Their target was the Sitka deer. They were experienced hunters and decided to spread out to cover more ground and find their prey. From Port Alexander, they trekked from the shoreline up into the forest. The beauty of the scenery was stunning. The skies were overcast and gray. A damp drizzle filled the air. While Harley remained closer to the shoreline, the others headed deeper into the forest. As Harley cut up further away from the beach, he came across the perfect hunting ground. The trees opened out into a wide plateau of muskeg or peat bog. It was an ideal place to spot deer that came wandering into the clearing from the forest. Quietly, he set down his backpack and raised his rifle, scoping the open expanse. Following the tree line around the bog, he saw nothing. All was quiet, all was still, only the occasional bird was heard. Harley lay down on the damp ground, keeping his eyes on the forest clearing. Patiently, he waited. Lying there, he lifted his deer collar to his mouth and blew. It mimicked the sound of a distressed fawn. Harley paused and held his breath. He could hear nothing. He blew the collar once more. He pricked his ears and scanned the tree line. The thrill of the wait was building. Any minute now, a deer could emerge into view. Any minute now, he could have his shot. As he lay there calling, listening, anticipating, he suddenly heard something. He looked to his left to see an enormous brown bear charging at him. There was no warning, there was no time to react. This wasn't a mock charge, the bear was onto him. Harley managed to let out a loud cry as the bear smashed into him, sending his rifle flying into the muskeg. The bear sunk its teeth into Harley's neck. It dug its claws into his shoulders, pinning him to the ground. Harley could hardly breathe. The sheer weight from the bear crushed his bones. The bear's jowls were dripping. Its breath was warm and wet, only inches from his own face. Harley let out an ear-piercing scream as the bear tore flesh from bone. The 700-pound grizzly bear attacked Harley so ferociously that his attempts to fight back were in vain. With the wind knocked from his lungs, the heavy weight of the animal pinning him into the cold, wet peatland, and such vicious bites and slashes, Harley only managed to scream out again and again, a blood-curdling scream that his two friends heard echoing through the forest. Harley was dead within minutes. Hearing their friends' distressed cries, David and James came running. They jumped over logs and dived under branches, calling out Harley's name. They ran as fast as they could, clutching their rifles and tearing through the undergrowth. When they got to the forest clearing, they could see nothing. They could hear nothing, not a cry or a scream, not a growl or a grunt. All was quiet once more, as if nothing had happened. They called out again. Searching around, they found Harley's backpack, right where he had left it. Then they saw it, a sight that shook them to the core. They saw a large pool of fresh blood on the ground. The shrubs had been flattened. They could see the struggle that had ensued. The earth had been torn up and thrown around. The trail of blood led off into the undergrowth. The two men ran as fast as they could to go and find help. They knew that Harley must be dead. They knew that he must have been taken by a bear, and they knew that the same bear was still out there. Sprinting through the rugged terrain, they made it back to Port Alexander. With its prey subdued, the bear had dragged Harley's body for half a mile parallel to the beach, looking for thicker cover to feed at its leisure. The The bear then dragged Harley for another mile deeper into the woods. With night closing in, a search and rescue operation wasn't initiated until the following day. Harley's distraught friends sat up all night, waiting and wondering. The thought of their friend being taken so savagely and so suddenly haunted them. The thought that his body was still out there was a chilling one. Fish and Wildlife Trooper Roland Young and Don Clutting, a member of the Sitka Volunteer Fire Department Search and Rescue Squad, headed up the search the next day. They flew down from Sitka to Port Alexander to commence their search. They were joined by a dozen residents of Port Alexander, all eager to help and locate the missing 40-year-old man. David and James led them to the spot where the attack happened. The search and rescue team were able to follow the trail left as the bear dragged Harley away. There was so much blood at the initial site that Roland Young was quite sure that Harley had been killed then and there before being dragged off. The trail was relatively easy to follow. The trodden undergrowth was marked with blood, and as the search team stepped deeper into the woodland, their nerves were on a knife edge. They knew they were getting closer to the bear. They began to find torn pieces of clothing and items belonging to Harley scattered along the trail they were following. His glasses were found on the ground amongst the leaves. His rifle lay submerged in the peat bog. Contents of his pockets strewn to one side. With every rustle in the trees and every chirp from a bird, the team jumped. Their hearts were racing. There was a predator within yards of them, and they were the prey. 3 of the men decided to wait on a nearby ledge, keeping an eye out for an approaching bear. Everyone had their rifles locked, loaded, and raised and ready. The others continued along the trail of blood and torn clothing. Creeping forwards, placing each foot carefully in front of the other, they suddenly heard a menacing growl. Their hearts leapt into their chests, pounding in their rib cages. Peering through the thick tree cover, they could just see the head of a grizzly standing over its kill. It was staring right at the 3 men on the ledge and went charging towards them. The others who had approached it from amongst the trees felt the bear rush past them. Its feet thundered on the damp ground. Its tremendous speed and power forced bushes and branches to the earth. They aimed their guns and shot the bear. The first shots hit the bear directly in the ribs, but the great animal didn't even flinch. It continued to bound towards the 3 horrified men. With nowhere to go, they were trapped. Another 2 shots fired. This time, it struck the bear near the shoulder, and it fell to the ground, just 3 feet from the search team. They fired once more into the animal's skull. The search and rescue team were shaken by the close call. The bear had nearly charged them down. The fearlessness and aggression displayed by this mighty and powerful grizzly had unnerved the team. Then came the devastating and harrowing job of moving Harley's remains from where they lay. He had been mostly devoured by the bear. It seems it had been a predatory attack rather than one of territorial dominance. Mock charges are common when territory has been encroached upon. If a bear does follow through with an attack, it often walks away after the initial attack if it considers you are no longer a threat. In the case of Harley, this had been the first fatal bear encounter in Southeast Alaska for more than a decade. On average, deadly bear attacks occur once every 3 or 4 years in Alaska. Between 2000 and 2017, there were 66 bear attacks in Alaska. Sadly, 10 of these proved fatal. But everyone knows that when you enter bear country, you do so at your own risk. This time, the hunter became the hunted, and sadly, met his terrifying final affliction. It was supposed to be a fresh start for 37-year-old Patty McConnell and 2 of her children, Kelly, 13, and Kristen, 7. From Texas, they had packed their bags and headed north. Their destination was Alaska, the great wilderness, the fresh air, the sense of adventure, and the prospect of new beginnings. With a long and arduous journey behind them and more than 12 hours ahead of them, Patty decided to pull over for a break. She spotted a sign along the highway, Liard River Hot Springs Provincial Park. It seemed like the perfect spot for them to stretch their legs and relax. It was a beautiful day on August 14, 1997. Raised wooden walkways led the family of 3 from the car park over the swampland to the hot springs. An area of tranquility awaited them. Surrounded by boreal forests, the pools of naturally warm water are a haven for wildlife. Many people bask in the warm pools, soaking in the beautiful surroundings. But with the natural beauty comes the danger. With the great wilderness comes the wild. Patty and the two children slipped into their swimming suits. Barefooted, they trotted excitedly along the wooden walkways towards the pristine waters. Kristen jumped into the pool first. She immersed herself in the water as the warmth engulfed her. Patty's son Kelly asked to walk to the next pool. Reluctantly, his mother agreed, telling Kristen to be safe in the water. Both Patty and Kelly walked a little further to the viewpoint. Pointing out the interesting plants that were encroaching on the still pools, they suddenly heard a noise, a rustling over Patty's shoulder. She turned around and was shocked to see a black bear only feet from them and the walkway. "Freeze, Mom," cried Kelly. Patty's heart thundered in her chest as she froze on the spot. The bear stared at the two of them, its eyes locked onto Patty's. She gasped as the bear took a step forwards. "Run, Mom," cried Kelly as the bear leapt up onto the walkway. The two of them sprinted up some steps to the lookout, but it was a dead end. With no time to think, Patty turned around just in time to see the bear launch itself right at her. She was knocked to the wooden floor. The 7-foot giant had her pinned down and was mauling her face. Patty screamed. Kelly grabbed a tree branch and whacked the bear. Again and again he hit the bear as it savagely bit Patty's face over and over. At first, the bear didn't flinch, but then it paused and looked up at Kelly. He let out a cry as the bear went for him. Its 2-inch claws sliced through his torso. He gasped, unable to do anything but try and curl up into a ball. Kelly and Patty's screams had been overheard by Ray Kitchen, a 56-year-old trucker from British Columbia. He had been bathing in one of the pools with his children, and now he sprinted along the wooden walkways. His feet thundered over the damp wooden slats. When he reached the lookout, he came to a sudden standstill. There, less than 6 feet away, stood a black bear with its back to him. He could see it straddling a young boy. Next to it lay the lifeless body of a woman. He yelled at the bear and, grabbing a branch from a tree, began banging on the railing. The crashing sound did nothing to distract the bear. It continued mauling Kelly, not so much as flinching at the commotion behind it. Ray took a step forward, still yelling at the huge beast. He jabbed at it with the tree branch. Driving the branch into the bear's side, the bear lifted its head. It turned and looked at Ray for a split second before diving at him. The sheer force from the impact sent Ray flying through the railings and onto the wet, boggy ground below. The bear pounced on him. Ray's screams were heard by others who came running to find out what was going on. Other tourists threw rocks, sticks, and stones at the bear, but to no avail. With the bear's focus now on Ray, Kelly was able to breathe. He had been badly injured. Deep gouges where the bear had slashed him with its claws covered his body. Bite marks scarred his face and neck. He crawled over to his mother. She moved at the sound of his voice. He held her hand. Her breathing was labored. Blood pooled around her body. Kelly told his mom that everything was going to be okay. He told her that they would make it through this together. She managed to utter a few final words. She told him to look after his younger sisters. She told him she loved him. Then, with a final squeeze of his hand, she sighed her last breath. Their screams, along with those from Ray, were heard by others. Frank Headingham was sunbathing by one of the lower pools and thought the noise was from the youngsters enjoying the water. But when he heard the words "help" and "bear," he leapt to action. He raced along the walkway towards the shouting. Ingrid Bailey was also walking along the paths when she heard the commotion. As a firefighter and first aider, she rushed to help. On the viewing platform, she found Kelly cradling his mother's head in his hands. She raced over to them and began CPR on Patty. Frank began wrapping a handkerchief around one of Kelly's open wounds, but then he heard another cry. It came from the bushes, only yards from where they were all gathered. It was Ray. He was still alive, only now his cries were quieter and less intense. The bear was still savaging him. Frank picked up a fallen branch. He began hitting the bear as it continued to attack Ray. The bear shifted its grip on Ray, lifting him into the air. It shook Ray's limp body. He was thrown around like a rag doll. The bear released its grip on Ray, leaving him crumpled on the ground. Ray was dead. When it was done, the bear turned its attention back to Kelly and his mom. From the swamps, it reached a single paw up onto the platform, clawing at Kelly's feet. Frank ran up to the bear and kicked it right in the snout. The bear immediately fell backwards. But instead of retreating into the undergrowth, it headed once more to the wooden walkways, where there were yet more tourists. The screams from the attacks had sent people running. News of a rampaging bear made its way through the park and fear spread. While Ingrid still fought to keep Patty alive, the bear continued its frenzy. Ambling along the boardwalks, the bear followed the distressed visitors. It picked up pace as the urge for another attack grew. In the panic, 28-year-old research assistant Arie van der Velden slipped and fell. He rolled off the boardwalk, and before he had time to pick himself up, the bear was upon him. It slashed his legs and bit into his arm. Arie felt the immense pressure of the bear's teeth. With a bite force of 800 psi, the black bear is typically an opportunistic predator and uses both its teeth and claws to subdue its prey. Arie cried out in agony. He desperately tried to fight the bear off, punching it in the snout, pulling its ears, and gouging its eyes. But the bear was so huge and powerful, Arie's efforts largely went unnoticed. As terrified visitors ran into the car park, Dave Webb, a 49-year-old businessman from Alaska, was just pulling in. He asked one of the fleeing people what was going on. Upon hearing that it was a bear attack, he grabbed 2 of his guns. He threw one to Dwayne Egerbroten, and the 2 of them headed along the boardwalks. They spotted the bear on top of Arie, who was still fighting for his life. Dwayne took aim and shot the bear in the back of the neck. The bear slumped to the ground. Dwayne fired 2 more shots into the bear just to make sure that it was dead. He and Dave jumped down to Arie and picked him up. Emergency services arrived on the scene. Despite the best efforts of Ingrid to revive Patty, the mother of 3 sadly died at the viewpoint. Her young son Kelly and Arie were both taken to the hospital. They fought for their lives and incredibly survived the ordeal. Kelly spent 3 weeks in a Canadian children's hospital. He suffered broken ribs, a punctured lung, a fractured vertebrae, and multiple deep lacerations. As the years have passed, he is still tormented by what happened to his mother. He asks himself over and over if he could have done more to protect her. But in reality, as a 13-year-old boy, he did more than most. Without hesitating, he attacked the bear. His heroic efforts had the desired effect and distracted the bear, but the damage to his mother had already been done. Ray, who also lost his life during the rampage, was awarded the Star of Courage posthumously the following year. More than 500 mourners turned out at his memorial service. Even the former President Bill Clinton wrote a letter to Ray's wife. He honored the bravery of a man who saved complete strangers, resulting in his own terrifying final affliction. Nestled in the far eastern reaches of Russia is a land of wild beauty and rugged wilderness, the Kamchatka Peninsula. Here, the earth boils and steams with hot springs and geysers shooting steam high into the sky. It is a place of raw power where the earth itself seems to be alive and breathing. It is also home to an array of wildlife, from the majestic brown bear to the elusive snow leopard, where they roam the land freely in harmony with the landscape. For those who dare to venture into its depths, the Kamchatka Peninsula offers an unforgettable experience, as the beauty of nature is on full display and the wilderness of the land can be felt in every breath. Vitaly Nikolayenko was one of Russia's best-known bear researchers to date. He had dedicated almost 30 years, which was approximately half of his life, to researching these majestic creatures. The 66-year-old was also a senior ranger in the Kronotsky Wildlife Reserve, where he constantly patrolled the wilderness to battle illegal fishing and hunting. It was during these patrols that Vitaly followed the enormous brown bears of the Kamchatka Peninsula while documenting their social, mating, and feeding habits. In the evening, he would return to his cabin, light the kerosene lamp, and then document nearly 800 bear contacts annually. His work turned into one of the most significant records of brown bear behavior ever made. As the years passed, Vitaly plunged into repeated encounters with bears. He got very close and personal with the bears, who seemed to not mind sharing their space with him. His personal favorite was a 6-foot male bear that he had named Krasavchik, which means handsome. He was fond of Krasavchik and at times would lie next to the beast as it took a nap. In December 2003, Vitaly had stayed on the reserve instead of leaving his home to celebrate the holiday season. He had stayed longer than expected while finishing up his research on why some of the bears had not yet gone to their dens. Being winter, the bears were supposed to have gone into hibernation, warmly tucked into a hollow tree or under the roots of a huge tree. It was a Friday, and Vitaly was sitting by the window in his cabin with his hands wrapped around a steaming cup of tea. Outside, the world was a frozen wasteland. The trees were heavy with snow as their branches bent low under the weight. He took a sip of his tea, savoring the warmth as it spread through his body. He felt the tension in his muscles begin to ease as a sense of calmness washed over him. He had just finished packing and was waiting for his flight out of the reserve. As he stared out at the snow-covered landscape, Vitaly felt a sense of peace. The cold and the silence of the winter seemed to soothe his soul, and for a moment, he could not help but picture the warm reception he would get from Tatiana, his wife, upon his arrival. Her laughter was music to his ears. Her voice and grace made his worries and cares fade away. He missed her. He sipped his tea, lost in thought as the winter world unfolded before him. He watched as the snowflakes drifted lazily through the air, with each one a unique and delicate creation. It was as if he was seeing the world through new eyes, a new dimension. This filled him with a sense of wonder and awe. And then he saw him. It was Krasovchik. His furry friend was headed to the half-frozen lake to quench his thirst. To kill the boredom, Vitaly decided to follow his favorite bear down to the lake, where he was sure to capture some award-winning pictures and memories to last a lifetime. He geared up and took with him his camera, flare gun, and bear spray, just in case things got out of hand. The lake was less than a mile from his cabin, and so he was sure he would be back before his helicopter arrived. As he stepped out into the snow, he felt the air was crisp and cold with a sharpness that seemed to cut through to the bone. His breath was puffing out clouds and the landscape was eerily quiet, as if the Kamchatka Peninsula itself was holding its breath. But he was no stranger to the harsh elements of this area, so he soldiered on. The growl of his friendly bear quickly freed him from his thoughts. He tried to trudge through the snow-covered trail in order to catch up, but the snow was deep and his feet were heavy. But he was determined. He quickly put on his cross-country skis, which allowed him to effortlessly glide across the snow-covered trail. He could see the bear's paw prints still fresh in the snow and was determined to keep up with Krasovchik. He pushed himself to go faster, his muscles strained and burned with exertion at the effort of pushing himself to the limit. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, but he did not falter. He tightened his coat around him. The trail wound its way through the trees and he followed it cautiously with his senses heightened by the knowledge that a bear was nearby. Moments later, he saw Krasovchik. There he was in a grove, sleeping soundly. His usually brown fur was now gleaming in the winter sunlight. This was going to be the perfect picture as a reward for his turmoil in the harsh weather. Vitaly took out his camera, but taking a clear picture was impossible, as the snow-covered branches and tree trunks kept getting in his way. He then made the risky decision to get inside the grove. He took his skis and stuck them vertically in the snow, got down on all fours, and then crawled, ducking and weaving through the tight spaces as he made his way through the branches. His eyes were fixed on his friend Krasovchik and his senses alert. He could hear his heavy but rhythmic breathing as he struggled to make his way through the pouring snow. The sound was almost peaceful, a big contrast to the natural ferocity of the bear. His chest rose and fell with each inhale, and with each exhale, a small plume of steam escaped from his nostrils, dissipating into the chilly air. It was a sight that melted Vitaly's heart. At about 3 meters from the sleeping bear, Vitaly took out his camera, ready to capture the beautiful scene for his memory book, as he had done numerous times before. On Saturday, the following day, the helicopter arrived, ready to airlift Vitaly out of the reserve for his holiday. The pilot found packed bags and a cold cup of tea by the cabin's window, but Vitaly was nowhere to be seen. He, without hesitation, called the search and rescue team, which arrived promptly and began searching. They followed Vitaly's ski trail, and just about a mile from the cabin, they found his skis at the entrance of the grove, placed vertically in the snow, just as he had done the day before. The rescue team then followed Vitaly's tracks into the grove, and just about 3 meters in, there he was. Vitaly's body lay there motionless. His bear spray can was empty, which led the rescue team to believe that he had used it to try to save his life. In the snow, they could see Krasovchik's tracks where he leapt to attack Vitaly. It seemed that the spray hadn't deterred the bear from attacking him. On his right side lay the unfired flare gun, which was half eaten. His camera lay inches away from his body. It was bloody and broken. The search and rescue team brought his lifeless body back from the wilderness for goodbyes and burial from his family. Despite his numerous research journals, Vitali's proactive approach of monitoring bears was broadly criticized by the conservation movement community, who argued that he went against the consensual passive method of ethology. In his defense, Vitali claimed that he never underestimated the tenacity of the bears, but this wasn't how his critics saw it, as to them, his death seemed to be a confirmation of their worries. In addition, in excess of over 20 bears that had become habituated in the presence of Vitali were easy targets for poachers and were killed just before and shortly after his death. As it is with nature, wild animals are just that, wild. One shouldn't get too comfortable when approaching wildlife, as their wild traits are intrinsically imprinted in their genetics, and they can snap at any time, leaving behind a lifeless body. For Vitali, this was a lesson learned a bit too late, but his journals shall forever be a constant reminder of his contribution to the science and academic community. He was a great loss to both man and nature, and the very animal he based his life around ultimately led to his final affliction. West Glacier, Montana is a place full of breathtaking beauty. This small town is nestled in the heart of the famous Rocky Mountains, surrounded by towering peaks, sparkling rivers, and dense forests. It boasts over 700 miles of hiking trails, countless crystal-clear lakes, and a vast array of wildlife. It is home to the Glacier National Park, from which locals as well as visitors can spot grizzly bears roaming the hillsides, moose wading in the waters, and eagles soaring overhead high in the skies. It is truly a place where the natural world takes center stage as the beauty of the outdoors is on full display. Brad Treat was a Forest Service law enforcement officer in the Flathead National Forest. He and his wife Summer Treat lived south of the Glacier National Park, a prime location that gave them unrestricted access to the Green Gate hiking trails. From their backyard, the couple was able to see the breathtaking views of the surrounding landscape. From a vast expanse of towering trees to rolling hills with sparkling streams, to them it was all they needed. I mean, what more could they ask for? It was a haven for outdoor enthusiasts, and boy did they love hiking and biking on this trail. Every morning, Bradley would jog alongside his wife for hours. He would also bike on the trails as many as 6 times a week, and being competitive, he would push himself harder to beat his previous record. And so it was no surprise when on the 29th of June 2016, Bradley invited his friend, whom we will refer to as Josh in this video, for biking on the trail. It was Josh's first mountain bike ride ever, and he was more than excited to join Bradley. It was a sunny Wednesday and the clocks were striking 1:30 p.m. when Bradley and his friend Josh hopped on their bikes and cycled to the trail. Being the first time for Josh, the rush of adrenaline and the feeling of freedom was unbeatable as they tackled twists and turns on the Green Gate hiking trail. As they navigated through the dense forests and over the rocky paths, they couldn't help but enjoy the exhilarating experience. The rugged terrain and natural obstacles provided a thrilling challenge. The wind whipped through their hair, and all they could hear was the crunching of gravel and dry leaves under their tires. They wanted more. Bradley, who was more familiar with the trail, found himself drawn into the moment, and he cycled like never before. He was cycling at a speed of 25 miles per hour, which is equivalent to a coyote chasing its prey at top speed. The crisp, fresh air filled his lungs, invigorating him with each breath. The trail was narrow with dense forest cover and thickets on both sides. They weren't planning on biking for long and thus had carried no bear spray, cell phones, or even rifles in case they encountered an aggressive animal while on the trail. The extras would also be heavy and tedious to cycle with, hence they saw no need of carrying them. Soon, Bradley was already leaving a gap between him and his friend Josh, who was struggling to keep up with his pace. He was leading the trail, and as he was negotiating a sharp blind corner, he slammed into something huge. His speed and the thick forest cover on the sides of the trail had obscured his view beyond the corner. He didn't have time to steer evasively or even skid to avoid the collision. It was a huge grizzly bear. The collision bolted Bradley into the handlebars of his bike and then over the bear. Newton's first law, or as we like to call it, the law of inertia, was in play. He knew that he would come thudding into the ground, and so he tried to break his fall with his hands. The impact of the fall made him break both of his wrists as well as his left scapula. Josh, who was 25 yards behind on the trail, heard the collision followed by a loud growl from the bear as if it was hurt. He couldn't see the bear or his friend Bradley, but he instinctively knew that something was amiss. He slowed down around the curve just in time to see the bear standing over Bradley. Standing on its hind legs, the bear towered over Bradley with its keen, piercing eyes fixated on him. Its massive body was covered in shaggy fur, the color of honey, but it was visibly mad over the collision. Josh and Bradley were scared and humbled by its presence. At this moment, Bradley was in excruciating pain. He tried to crawl away, but his efforts were futile. The bear let out a deafening roar, and with its sharp claws extended and ready to attack, it swiped at him. With the claws tearing through his flesh, blood spilled onto the ground, mixing with the dirt and the leaves. Bradley knew that he had met the raw power of nature in this untamed wilderness. His movements grew sluggish and weak as the bear continued swiping its claws and biting him. His helmet was crushed into pieces by the bear's mighty biting force. Bradley was helpless. With no bear spray, a rifle, or a cell phone, Josh knew that he couldn't confront the bear. For a moment, he froze. Fear gripped his heart like a vice. He didn't know what to do to save his friend, but he knew that he had to get help. The bear had all its attention turned to Bradley and didn't notice the presence of Josh. With this narrow window of escape, Josh got on his bike and pedaled as fast as he could. His legs pumped frantically as the forest whipped past him in a blur while he navigated the rugged terrain. He leaned into the winding trail, narrowly avoiding colliding with trees and branches as he raced back the direction they had taken towards help. From afar, he heard the sound of vehicles and pushed himself harder, desperate to reach the highway before it was too late for Bradley. The vehicles were traveling on Highway 2, which was approximately 1 mile away from the trail. This meant that Josh couldn't continue cycling as the shortest route was through the thick forest. He had to bushwhack off trail. He clutched his bike tightly to his side, the metal frame clanging against the trees as he stumbled through the underbrush. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he tried to make ground on Highway 2. His forehead glistened with beads of sweat as the sun beat down on him, making him feel as though he was running through a sauna. He pictured Bradley crying for his help, an image that made him redouble his efforts. He saw the highway up ahead and continued to push himself to the limit. As he burst into the open, Josh saw a vehicle that he flagged down amidst his gasp for air. His lungs were burning. He was immediately driven to a phone where he called the 911 dispatch team. The initial police respondents then promptly arrived at the scene of the attack. They found Bradley's lifeless body in a pool of blood and his bike next to him with his helmet bitten to pieces. He was confirmed dead with none of his body parts mauled by the bear. Forensic analysis of the hair and swab samples collected from Bradley and his helmet indicated that the tenacious beast was an 18 to 20-year-old male grizzly bear that had no prior incidents of human-bear conflict. It was estimated to weigh 370 pounds, showing how enormous the bear really was. Since grizzly bears in Montana are federally protected under the Endangered Species Act, Bradley's incident was probed by a board consisting of Natural Resource Agency employees. Investigations from the attack scene showed that the confrontation was not a predatory attack, but rather a surprise contact. The bear was probably on the wrong trail at the wrong time, and so was Bradley. The conclusion to the findings was drawn from the facts that no part of Bradley's body had been consumed by the bear and also that he had not been buried. This is because bears have the custom of covering items they intend to store and return to use or maul later. They cover them with any available debris and dirt and use their strong sense of smell to retrace their steps, returning to their kill at a later time. Despite the forest being home to over 1,000 grizzly bears, Bradley's encounter was the first incident in Montana where a biker had been killed by a bear. His wife, Summer Treat, urged people to remember Bradley for his service and not for the gruesome way he died. It was a tragic reminder of the dangers that lurk in the wilderness and the need to always be prepared. While attacks like this are rare, once a grizzly targets you, chances are you're about to meet your final affliction. Glacier Bay National Park is a 3.3 million acre park found in southeast Alaska and can only be reached by plane or boat as it is surrounded by an extreme landscape. With icy mountain peaks, deep glacial fjords, and a rich abundance of wildlife, the park attracts over 500,000 visitors each year. The American government has even described it as one of the few places left on Earth that offers human solitude in a remote wilderness, leading it to becoming one of the hotspots for campers and survivalists to prove just how good their skills really are. The lush green forests offer cover from the biting cold, and although rugged and remote, its beauty is hard to dispute. In addition to lynx, mountain lions, coyotes, and wolves, there are also two different species of bears present in this park, the brown and black bears. Although usually docile, changing climate conditions have taken their toll on these predators, and sometimes, out of desperation due to their starvation, they can even attack and eat humans. On September 10, 1976, 25-year-old Alan Precup had arranged to travel to the Glacier Bay National Park and was planning to camp for a few days with just a backpack containing everything he needed. He had planned his travel route and was aware of the remoteness of his trip, meaning that if anything went wrong, he knew that he would be all on his own. Despite this, he felt confident in his ability to survive and headed out into the woods. Unfortunately for Alan, this would be the last anyone ever saw of him. A few days later, on September 13th, a search party was formed. Alan hadn't returned back to the base that he had previously agreed, and the officials were becoming concerned. They arranged for a large group to scour the area in hopes that he may have just gotten lost or fallen somewhere awaiting help. The search continued for days, and still no one was able to locate Alan. While the search party was still underway, another group was hiking into the White Thunder Ridge near the Muir Inlet. And while they were not actively looking for Alan, they were aware of this situation and had agreed to keep an eye out just in case. Although they were only planning to stay for one night, they already felt more comfortable with their journey knowing that there are search crews in the areas, so if they fell into any trouble, it would be much easier to get help than normal. The group included a small group of friends: Charles Jackson, Lilena Vega, Peter Talbot, and Colin Milmer. They were avid hikers and were keen to begin their latest journey. As they were setting up camp, they were slowly relaxing into their new surroundings and felt at peace. The quiet of the surrounding glaciers creating a kind of soundproofing effect like a fishbowl. At around 11:30 a.m., Peter noticed something far off in the distance that was moving very slowly towards them. Given the distance, he couldn't quite make out what the animal was, but he could see it was large and brown. Maybe a caribou? He continued to watch it, and his friends now joined him, curious as to what the animal would turn out to be. As they kept watch, they realized that it was a small brown bear, and while they were excited to see the animal in its natural habitat, they also knew that they should stop it from getting much closer to fully reduce any risk. They began to make lots of noise, using pots and pans to scare off the animal, yelling at it so that it would soon change its direction back into the trees. This seemed to confuse the bear instead of scare it away. It could hear the clangs in the distance, but didn't know where it was coming from. After stopping for a few seconds, he slowly continued towards the group. They decided that it would be best to pack up their food and move to higher ground until the bear leaves, hoping that the extra rock cover would mean that the bear would not bother them. After some time, they reached the top of the cliff's peak and were able to see their camp below them, now being viciously ripped apart by the bear. They could hear the animal's grunts and snarls from below and were startled by its unprovoked aggression as it tore into anything with the scent of a human upon it. They watched in horror as the bear began to sniff the floor and follow the path that they had just taken into the cliffs. It was becoming clear that the animal was hunting for them and was determined to find and kill them. They immediately decided that they needed to create more space between themselves and the predator, leaving their food stash behind in hopes that the animal was just hunting for food and would be satiated enough to leave them alone. Their blood ran cold when the bear continued past the food, ignoring it in the hope of a better prize, someone from the group. They realized that the bear was determined to get a human meal, so they continued into the cliffs, hoping to find some form of protection as the animal was hot on their trail. Following their scent for miles, they circled back to their camp, hoping that they had lost the animal in its confusion, but it was still following them. The group started to panic as they realized that the bear was not giving up, as it had been following them for nearly 2 hours now with no sign of stopping. They knew that they had no time to rest, that the bear would be upon them soon. They continued upwards again, adrenaline forcing them to keep moving as they went back up into the cliffs again, stripping off their clothing to cool themselves down, as well as hopefully slow the bear down. They hoped that if they left their clothes, the bear would stop to destroy them rather than continue to follow them, but no luck. Now the approaching bear was only 20 feet apart from them, their scent only encouraging the bear further as it knew it was close to its next meal. When they reached the top of the hill, the bear had gained on them even further, and now only 10 feet separated them from certain death. They began to realize that their only hope was going to be to fight this animal, as it was not giving up until it had killed someone. They began to throw rocks at the bear, who was seemingly confused by the attacks, so moved further away, then lay down to observe them, never taking its eye off of its prize. Suddenly, a plane flew overhead, but although it circled them many times, they were not spotted, and so they were still as vulnerable as before. They decided to use the cover of the plane to venture back down the hill, hoping that the bear would not notice and so would not follow. They just needed to get back to other people, to safety. Luckily, they made it back down and encountered some other campers in the area. As they explained their ordeal and the strange behavior of the bear, the group witnessed the bear appear at the crest of the hill, sniffing the air in search of them. They all decided to run to put as much distance between themselves and this murderous bear. After some time, they arrived back at the Forest Service boat where they were able to tell their story to the rangers nearby. They recognized that this bear was exhibiting very strange behavior, as they knew it would not usually specifically hunt for humans, unless it had eaten human flesh before. This disturbing realization made the rangers finally understand what had happened to poor Alan Precup. They set off in their helicopter, praying that they were wrong but knowing in their hearts what had happened. After the rangers scoured the area once again, they finally came across the gruesome remains of Alan. Only a few days had passed, but it was clear that the bear had finished his meal. His bones were stripped clean and gleamed in the sunlight, his ribcage destroyed by the animal. Parts of Alan were found all over the camp. His arms had been torn from his body, only leaving exposed bones in the ground. His legs and feet, though completely removed from his body, were still encased in his socks and boots, an unnerving reminder that his pile of blood and bones was a living person just a few days before. It's unknown as to how quickly Alan would have died, although we would hope that he was killed by the initial bite to the neck and head, which severed the bones and left him decapitated. We would hope that this is how he met his end, but even if this were true, his last moments would have been terrifying. If the bear attacked him somewhere else, maybe slamming into him and pushing him to the ground where he slowly began to eat the flesh from his bones, this would be a much more horrific way to die, and is hardly worth thinking about when you imagine the true horror of the entire experience. The rangers were able to gather up Alan's remains and return them to his family, but with very little flesh left on his corpse, the family had to bury him in a closed casket. A reminder to all those in attendance of the horrible events that took place leading up to his final affliction.